In the warm spring evenings of 1861, across the plantations of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, an extraordinary scene was taking place. Wealthy planters were gathering their field hands and setting fire to their own wealth. They weren't burning trash. They were burning cotton. Bales of it. Thousands of pounds of the most valuable commodity on earth going up in flames while the planters stood watching with satisfied smiles on their faces. They believed they were lighting the fuse on a weapon that would bring the greatest empire in the world to its knees. They believed they were forcing Europe's hand, compelling Britain and France to recognize the Confederate States of America and break the Union blockade. They believed that within months, maybe weeks, European warships would arrive to secure their cotton supply, and the war would be won without firing a shot. They were wrong about everything. What they were actually doing was committing economic suicide. They were destroying the only leverage they had. And they were doing it voluntarily, enthusiastically, with the absolute confidence of men who had never been told no by anyone in their entire lives. The logic behind this madness had a name: cotton diplomacy. And it rested on a single, unshakable belief that had been repeated so often it had become gospel in the South. Cotton is king. Senator James Hammond of South Carolina had declared it from the Senate floor in 1858. And his words had been quoted in every Southern newspaper for years. "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it." Cotton is king. The numbers seemed to back him up. Before the war, the southern states produced 75% of the world's cotton. The textile mills of Lancashire and England employed 4 million people directly or indirectly. Those mills consumed southern cotton and turned it into cloth that was sold across the British Empire and beyond. Cotton wasn't just important to the British economy. It was the foundation of it. The French textile industry was equally dependent. The factories of Normandy and Alsace ran on American cotton. Millions of European workers depended on southern fields for their livelihoods. So the Confederate strategists made what seemed like a brilliant calculation. If we cut off the cotton supply, they reasoned, Europe will suffocate economically. The mill workers will riot. The governments will face revolution. Britain and France will have no choice but to intervene, to recognize our independence, to break the blockade, and possibly even to send troops. Cotton wasn't just a crop. It was a hostage. And the Confederacy was going to use it to extort recognition from the great powers of Europe. In the summer of 1861, the Confederate government didn't impose an official export ban. They didn't have to. They simply encouraged Southern planters to voluntarily withhold cotton from the market. And the planters, confident in their power, complied enthusiastically. Ships that had carried cotton to Liverpool sat empty in Charleston and New Orleans. Warehouses filled with bales that would never be loaded. Some planters, wanting to make absolutely sure their cotton didn't reach European markets, burned it outright. They were weaponizing scarcity. They were going to starve Europe until Europe gave them what they wanted. But there was something the Confederate strategists didn't know. Something they hadn't bothered to check. Something that would turn their weapon into a noose around their own necks. In the warehouses of Liverpool, in the great storage facilities along the docks of the River Mersey, there was cotton, mountains of it, more cotton than the Confederacy had burned. And it had been sitting there since 1860 just waiting. The Confederate strategists had made their calculations in Richmond sitting rooms and plantation parlors, surrounded by maps and confident assumptions. But they had never walked the docks of Liverpool. If they had, they would have seen something that would have terrified them. Cotton, everywhere, stacked in warehouses that stretched for blocks along the waterfront. Bales piled so high they blocked out the windows. The reserve supply of the British Empire. In 1860, anticipating possible disruptions from American political tensions, British merchants had done what British merchants always did. They had hedged their bets. They had stockpiled. They had bought enormous quantities of American cotton and stored it. When the Confederate embargo hit in the summer of 1861, the mills of Lancashire didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They simply opened their warehouses and drew down their reserves. There was enough cotton already in Britain to keep the looms running for 18 months, possibly 2 years. The Confederate diplomats in London, James Mason and John Slidell, sent increasingly frantic reports back to Richmond. The crisis they had expected to materialize within weeks wasn't happening. British newspapers weren't screaming about cotton shortages. Mill workers weren't rioting. The government wasn't showing any signs of panic. The weapon wasn't working. But the real catastrophe was happening on the other side of the world, and the Confederacy wouldn't understand its implications until it was far too late. In Egypt, British colonial administrators received urgent telegrams from London. The message was simple: increase cotton production immediately. Whatever resources you need, you have them. Just grow cotton. Egyptian farmers, who had been growing modest amounts of long staple cotton for years, suddenly found themselves with access to British capital, British agricultural experts, and British markets desperate for their product. Within a single growing season, Egyptian cotton production doubled. By 1863, it would triple. In India, the response was even more dramatic. The British Raj controlled vast territories with climates perfectly suited to cotton cultivation. British administrators redirected Indian agriculture with the efficiency of an empire that had been managing colonial resources for 2 centuries. Indian cotton, which had previously been a minor player in global markets, exploded in volume. Fields that had grown food crops were converted to cotton. New lands were brought under cultivation. By 1862, India was exporting more cotton than it ever had in history. The British Empire had done what empires do. It had adapted. It had found alternatives. And in the process, it had made Southern cotton optional. Back in the Confederacy, the planters were beginning to realize they had made a catastrophic mistake. By late 1862, some were quietly trying to ship cotton to Europe through the Union blockade. But they discovered something devastating. The prices had collapsed. European buyers weren't desperate anymore. They had Egyptian cotton. They had Indian cotton. They had their stockpiles. Why would they pay premium prices for Southern cotton that was difficult to obtain and came with huge insurance costs due to the blockade? The leverage the Confederacy thought it had was evaporating. The crisis they had tried to create had instead created alternatives to their own product. They had trained Europe to live without them. And there was no going back. Egyptian and Indian farmers now invested in cotton production weren't going to simply stop growing it when the war ended. British textile manufacturers, having established supply chains and relationships with colonial producers, weren't going to abandon them to return to dependence on the American South. The Confederacy had believed cotton was king. But what they hadn't understood was that in the industrial age, no single source of any commodity is irreplaceable. There are always alternatives. There are always substitutes. And monopolies only last until someone finds a way around them. The South had voluntarily given up its monopoly, and the world had moved on without them. By the spring of 1862, the cruel absurdity of the South situation was becoming impossible to ignore. In warehouses across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, millions of pounds of cotton sat rotting. The bales were stacked to the ceiling, covered in dust and mold, slowly degrading in the humid southern heat. The planters who owned this cotton were going broke. Some were already bankrupt. They had spent the previous year's planting season growing a crop they couldn't sell, using credit they couldn't repay, and feeding slaves they could barely afford to keep. And now they were doing it again. Because despite everything, despite the obvious failure of cotton diplomacy, despite the fact that European mills were running fine without them, the planters couldn't break the habit. They kept planting cotton. Cotton was what they knew. Cotton was what their fathers had planted. Cotton was what made them wealthy before the war. Surely, they told themselves, the market would come back. Surely Europe would need them again. Surely this was temporary. But while the planters were clinging to their delusions, the Confederate population was starving. The South had never been self-sufficient in food production. Before the war, Southern states had imported grain from the Midwest, pork from Ohio, and beef from Texas. But now the Union blockade had cut off coastal trade, and Union armies controlled the Mississippi River, severing the supply lines from the Western Confederacy. The food crisis was compounded by a brutal reality. The same land that could grow cotton could grow corn, wheat, and vegetables. But it was doing neither efficiently because planters kept prioritizing cotton. In the winter of 1862, state legislatures across the South began passing increasingly desperate laws. They begged planters to dedicate more acreage to food crops. Some states limited cotton cultivation to a certain percentage of each plantation's land. Others imposed taxes on cotton production to discourage it. The governors wrote pleading letters to plantation owners. They explained that cities were running out of food. They warned that armies couldn't fight on empty stomachs. They pointed out that Confederate currency was worthless if there was nothing to buy with it. The planters resisted. Some openly defied the laws. They argued that cotton was still valuable and that they needed to maintain production to take advantage when the market recovered. What they really meant was that they couldn't imagine themselves as anything other than cotton planters. Their entire identity, their wealth, their social status, everything was bound up in that single crop. The result was a society eating itself alive. In Richmond, in April 1863, hundreds of women rioted in the streets, breaking into shops and seizing bread, flour, and meat. They weren't criminals. They were mothers watching their children starve. The Confederate government had to send troops to suppress the riot, troops who were also going hungry. In Mobile, in Savannah, and in Charleston, similar scenes played out. The civilian population was experiencing food shortages that ranged from severe to catastrophic. Prices for basic staples skyrocketed. A barrel of flour that cost $7 before the war was selling for $70 in Confederate currency by 1863, if you could find it at all. And through all of this, in the countryside, surrounded by fields that should have been growing food, sat those warehouses full of unsellable cotton. The irony was grotesque and undeniable. The South was sitting on mountains of what they had called their greatest asset, their king commodity, the crop that was supposed to win them the war and their independence. And they were starving to death next to it. Cotton couldn't be eaten. It couldn't feed armies. It couldn't buy guns when no one wanted to accept it as payment. The king was dead, but the South hadn't realized it yet. They were still bowing to a corpse while their people went hungry. By late 1863, the Confederate government had finally accepted a truth that should have been obvious 2 years earlier. The cotton embargo had been a disaster. Now they were trying desperately to reverse course. But reversing a strategic blunder doesn't undo its consequences. The same cotton that planters had burned in 1861, the same cotton they had proudly withheld from European markets, the same cotton that was supposed to be their ultimate weapon, they were now desperate to sell at any price. Confederate agents in Europe were instructed to liquidate cotton stocks immediately. Ship it, sell it, convert it to cash or credit that could buy weapons, medicine, and supplies. The treasury in Richmond was empty. The printing presses were running day and night, churning out worthless paper. Cotton was the only real asset the Confederacy had left. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, each one compounding the next into a perfect storm of economic catastrophe. First, they had to get the cotton to Europe. The Union blockade, which had been relatively porous in 1861, had tightened into a noose by 1863. Hundreds of Union warships patrolled the southern coastline. Running the blockade had become a deadly gamble. Small, fast ships called blockade runners would load cotton bales at night in ports like Wilmington, Charleston, and Mobile then make a dash for Nassau in the Bahamas or Bermuda, where the cotton could be transferred to British ships for the voyage to Liverpool. It was dangerous, expensive, and inefficient. Insurance rates on Confederate cotton shipments were astronomical. Shipping costs ate up huge percentages of the cotton's value, and many ships never made it at all. They were captured by Union patrols or sunk or driven back to port. The cotton that was supposed to save the Confederacy was ending up at the bottom of the Atlantic or in Union warehouses. But even the cotton that successfully reached Europe faced a devastating reality. Nobody particularly wanted it anymore. The British and French textile manufacturers had spent 2 years building relationships with Egyptian and Indian cotton suppliers. They had signed contracts. They had adjusted their machinery to process different grades of cotton. They had created new supply chains that worked perfectly well. More importantly, they had learned a painful lesson about depending on a single unstable source. Why would they rush back to buying American cotton from a nation in the middle of a civil war when they had reliable alternatives? The Confederate agents in Liverpool and Paris discovered they were in the weakest possible negotiating position. They were desperate sellers with a product the market no longer needed, trying to sell it under terrible conditions. The prices they received were brutal. Cotton that had traded at 12 cents per pound before the war was selling for 8 cents, sometimes 6 cents in European markets. And that was before deducting the massive costs of shipping and insurance. By the time the cotton reached Europe, was sold, and the proceeds were converted to British pounds or French francs, the Confederate government was receiving perhaps 30 to 40% of the pre-war value. And even that meager return was often immediately consumed by existing debts. Remember those Erlanger bonds from our previous story? The Confederate government owed cotton to bondholders. Much of what they were now desperately shipping to Europe wasn't even generating new revenue. It was just fulfilling old obligations. James Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, looked at the accounts in late 1863 and calculated a grim reality. The South had enough cotton in warehouses and fields to theoretically buy all the weapons and supplies they needed. But they couldn't convert it to usable purchasing power fast enough. The weapon that was supposed to win the war in 1861 couldn't even fund the war in 1863. King. Cotton had been dethroned, and the South was learning that in economics, timing is everything. The right asset at the wrong moment is worthless. By early 1863, the Confederate state governments were facing a crisis that made battlefield defeats look manageable by comparison. Their civilian population was starving. Not metaphorically, actually starving. The governors realized they had to do something radical. They had to force the planters to stop growing cotton and start growing food. The laws they passed became known as produce or starve legislation, and they represented an unprecedented intervention in the Southern agricultural economy. Georgia led the way. In March 1863, the state legislature passed a law limiting cotton and tobacco cultivation to 3 acres per field hand. Any planter who violated the limit would face heavy fines and have their excess cotton seized by the state. The message was clear: grow food or face consequences. North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana followed with similar laws. Some states went further, imposing taxes on cotton production that made it economically punitive to plant. Others authorized county officials to inspect plantations and enforce compliance. But passing laws and enforcing them in the Confederacy were two very different things. The planter class, the same men who controlled the state legislatures, the same men who had started this war to protect their economic system, were not about to let their own governments tell them what to plant. They resisted. They found loopholes. They bribed local officials. They hid cotton production. Their argument was always the same. Cotton would win the war. Cotton would buy European recognition. Cotton was their only valuable asset. They couldn't just stop producing it. That would be surrender. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These men were watching their own populations starve while they planted a crop that nobody wanted to buy, and they still believed they were making the correct economic decision. Meanwhile, in the cities, the consequences were impossible to ignore. On April 2, 1863, in Richmond, the Confederate capital, hundreds of women gathered in the streets. They weren't protesting politics, they were demanding food. They marched from the Oregon Hill neighborhood toward the commercial district, and their numbers swelled as they walked. By the time they reached Main Street, it was a mob of over 1,000 people. They called it the bread riot, but it was more than bread they wanted. They smashed shop windows and seized flour, bacon, shoes, clothing, and anything they could carry. The police couldn't stop them. Finally, President Jefferson Davis himself appeared on the street. He climbed onto a wagon and addressed the crowd. He told them to disperse, or he would order troops to fire on them. He gave them 5 minutes. The women, some holding crying children, slowly backed away, but the message was sent. The Confederate capital was on the edge of starvation, and the population's patience was exhausted. Similar riots broke out in Mobile, Savannah, and Atlanta. Each time, the pattern was the same. Desperate women, empty shelves, shops ransacked, and troops called out to restore order. The Confederacy was suppressing food riots in its own cities while its plantations grew cotton. The contrast with the North was devastating and instructive. Northern farms were producing record harvests of wheat, corn, and livestock. Union soldiers were fed adequately, sometimes even well. The Northern economy, fueled by industrial production and agricultural exports, was actually growing during the war. The South, blessed with equally fertile soil and a longer growing season, was starving itself by choice, by stubborn adherence to cotton, by refusal to adapt. Historians would later estimate that if Southern planters had converted even 50% of their cotton acreage to food crops in 1861, the Confederacy could have fed itself throughout the war. The famine was not inevitable. It was not imposed by the Union blockade alone. It was self-inflicted. A wound caused by economic delusion and planter arrogance. The South was learning that you cannot eat cotton, you cannot pay soldiers with cotton that won't sell, and you cannot win a war when your population is rioting for bread. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, the guns fell silent, but for the Southern economy, the real catastrophe was just becoming visible in the daylight. The planters who had survived the war intact walked back to their plantations, expecting to resume their old lives. They had their land. They still had cotton in their warehouses, some of it from 1861 still waiting to be sold. They assumed that now, with the war over, the cotton market would return to normal. Europe would need American cotton again. Prices would recover. The natural order would be restored. They were about to learn that economic disruption is permanent. In the warehouses of Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans, millions of pounds of cotton sat waiting for buyers who would never come. The planters sent urgent letters to cotton brokers in Liverpool and New York. They offered their cotton at what they thought were reasonable prices. The prices from 1860 adjusted slightly downward. The responses they received were brutal. The brokers weren't interested. Or if they were interested, they were offering prices so low they were insulting. 4 cents per pound. 3 cents, sometimes less. The planters couldn't understand it. Cotton was cotton. The war was over. Why weren't the mills rushing to buy American cotton again? The answer was simple and devastating. The mills had moved on. During the 4 years of the Confederate cotton embargo and the subsequent blockade, the British textile industry had fundamentally restructured itself. The mills of Lancashire had retooled their machinery to process Egyptian and Indian cotton. They had signed long-term contracts with suppliers in Cairo and Bombay. They had built relationships, established supply chains, and created an entire economic ecosystem that didn't include the American South. Egyptian cotton production, which had been modest before the war, had increased by over 500% by 1865. Egypt had become the second largest cotton exporter in the world. Indian cotton exports had quadrupled. These weren't temporary substitutes waiting to be replaced. These were permanent new competitors. And they had advantages the American South couldn't match. Egypt and India were part of the British Empire. Shipping from Alexandria or Mumbai to Liverpool didn't require crossing an ocean where pirates or enemy navies might lurk. Insurance was cheaper. Transit was faster. Political risk was lower. Most importantly, British mill owners had learned a lesson they would never forget. Never depend on a single source for a critical input. The cotton embargo of 1861 had taught them that American cotton could be weaponized, could be withheld, and could be interrupted by political instability. They would never make themselves that vulnerable again. For the Southern planters, this realization came slowly and painfully. At first, they told themselves it was temporary. They blamed the low prices on post-war disruption. They convinced themselves that quality would win out, that British manufacturers would remember that American cotton was superior. But month after month, year after year, the old market never returned. Cotton prices remained depressed. The Southern cotton that had sold for 12 cents per pound in 1860 was selling for 6 or 7 cents in 1870. And that was for the planters who could find buyers at all. The financial devastation was total. Planters who had been millionaires before the war were now scrambling to pay property taxes. Plantations that had been in families for generations were seized for debt and sold at auction. The wealth of the South, which had been concentrated in land and slaves, had evaporated. The slave system was gone, abolished by the 13th Amendment. That alone wiped out billions of dollars in what Southerners had considered assets. But the cotton market collapse was a second blow, one that ensured there would be no quick recovery. The South had built its entire economy on a single commodity. They had weaponized that commodity. And they had discovered, too late, that commodities are only valuable if someone wants to buy them. The customer base was gone, it wasn't coming back. And the South would spend the next century paying for that mistake. The death of King Cotton wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, agonizing decline that played out over decades. But if you had to mark the funeral, it would be sometime around 1870, when even the most delusional planters finally accepted that the old world was never coming back. Cotton prices had stabilized by then, but stabilized at a level that made profitable plantation agriculture almost impossible. 7 cents per pound was the new normal. In some years it dropped to 5 cents. The 12-cent cotton of 1860 was a memory that old men told young men who didn't believe them. At those prices, the old plantation system couldn't function. The planters didn't have slaves anymore, which meant they had to pay for labor. But they didn't have cash to pay wages. They barely had cash to pay their property taxes and mortgages. The solution they invented was sharecropping, and it would trap the South in poverty for the next 70 years. The system worked like this. A planter would divide his land into small plots and rent them to former slaves or poor white farmers. The tenant would farm the land, and at harvest time, they would split the crop with the landowner, usually 50-50. The landlord would also provide seed, tools, and supplies on credit to be repaid after harvest. It sounded fair on paper, but in practice it was debt slavery. The prices the landlords charged for supplies were inflated. The prices they paid for the harvested cotton were depressed. The accounting was done by the landlord, who often couldn't read but somehow always discovered that the tenant owed money at the end of the year. The tenant would start the next year deeper in debt. The cycle would repeat. Families would work the same plot of land for generations and never own anything. They couldn't leave because the law made it illegal to abandon a debt. They couldn't save because there was never a surplus. It was a system designed to extract labor from people who had no alternatives, and it kept both black and white Southerners locked in perpetual poverty. The Southern economy, which had been the wealthiest region in America before the war, became the poorest. Per capita income in the South in 1900 was less than half the national average. It would remain that way until World War II. The infrastructure crumbled. Railroads fell into disrepair. Schools were underfunded. Public health was a disaster. The South became a place people left, not a place people moved to. Millions of African Americans would eventually flee north in the Great Migration, looking for opportunities that didn't exist in the cotton fields. And through all of this, the bitter irony hung in the air like humidity. The South had done this to itself. The Cotton Embargo of 1861 was supposed to be a weapon aimed at Europe. It was supposed to force British intervention. It was supposed to win the war without bloodshed. Instead, it had destroyed the Southern economy more effectively than Sherman's army ever could. Sherman burned Atlanta. The Cotton Embargo burned the South's economic future for a century. The planters who lit those bonfires in 1861, who proudly withheld their cotton from European markets, and who declared that cotton was king and the world would bow to their demands, had shot themselves in the foot. And the wound never healed. Egypt and India kept growing cotton. British mills kept buying from them. The global cotton market adapted and moved on. The American South, which had once controlled 75% of world production, became a marginal player in a market it used to dominate. King Cotton was dead. The funeral lasted decades. And the mourners were the generations of Southerners who paid the price for their ancestors' arrogance. The weapon had backfired, and the South would limp from that self-inflicted wound for generations. When historians tally the costs of the Civil War, they count the battles, the casualties, and the burned cities. Sherman's march through Georgia gets its own chapter in every textbook. The destruction of Atlanta, the burning of Columbia, and the devastation of the Shenandoah Valley, all documented, all remembered. But the greatest destruction of Southern wealth wasn't caused by Union armies. It was caused by Southern planters in the spring of 1861 when they decided to weaponize cotton. Let's do the math. Sherman's march destroyed an estimated $100 million in property. It was brutal, it was devastating, and it left a scar on the South that lasted generations. But the Cotton Embargo? The voluntary withholding of cotton from European markets, the burning of bales, and the refusal to sell when buyers were desperate. That decision cost the South its entire economic future. It permanently destroyed the cotton market that had made the region wealthy. It created the conditions for Egyptian and Indian competition that would never go away. It transformed the South from the richest region in America to the poorest, a status it would hold for the next 80 years. If you could quantify the total wealth destroyed by the Cotton Embargo, the lost sales, the collapsed prices, the permanent loss of market share, the decades of poverty that followed, you'd be measuring in the billions of dollars. Sherman's march was a tactical strike. The Cotton Embargo was economic suicide. And the truly maddening part, it was completely avoidable. Nobody forced the South to embargo cotton. There was no Union blockade in the summer of 1861. European mills were desperate for cotton and willing to pay premium prices. The South could have sold every bale it produced and filled its treasury with British pounds and French francs. Instead, they burned it. They withheld it. They turned their greatest asset into a weapon and then discovered that economic weapons can be turned against you. This pattern repeats throughout history. Nations that try to weaponize commodities usually end up destroying their own economies. OPEC's oil embargoes in the 1970s didn't crush the West, they sparked a massive investment in alternative energy and fuel efficiency that permanently reduced oil demand. Russia's weaponization of natural gas in the 2020s accelerated Europe's shift to renewable energy. The lesson is always the same. Monopolies are temporary. Dependencies can be broken. And when you force your customers to find alternatives, they usually do and they don't come back. The South's experience with the cotton embargo is the textbook case. They had a genuine monopoly on a critical commodity. They controlled supply, they had willing buyers, and they had the opportunity to convert that advantage into wealth and power. Instead, they got greedy. They got arrogant. They believed their own propaganda about cotton being king. They thought Europe would have no choice but to bow to their demands. They forgot that in economics, there's always a choice. There are always alternatives, and customers have long memories. When you hold a gun to someone's head in a business deal, they don't forget it. They find a new supplier, and they never make themselves vulnerable to you again. The South learned this lesson the hardest way possible. They spent the next century paying for the arrogance of 1861. Generations of Southerners lived in poverty because their grandparents thought they could blackmail Europe with cotton. The self-inflicted wound never fully healed. Even today, the legacy of that decision echoes through the economic statistics of the American South. I'm Mark, and this is the Economic Warfare Tales channel. Subscribe now because the most important lessons in history aren't about the wars that were fought. They're about the economic decisions that destroyed entire civilizations. And when you understand how nations really collapse, you'll never look at the news the same way again.